So, hi, my name's Sarah Williams. I work at Green Alliance, which is an environmental think tank based in London.
And I'm Faten Aggad. I'm the Executive Director of the African Future Policies Hub. We're a policy support organization focusing on Africa as a region. Sarah, you worked quite a bit on CBAM, and I'm curious how that is viewed from the UK's point of view. So, if the UK is to introduce its own CBAM, how is that viewed within the UK?
Thanks. I think first and foremost, we all know we need more climate action at home and abroad. Like all countries need to reduce their carbon emissions, but some are doing it faster than others. We also completely understand that governments need to ensure that industries which are cutting their emissions are not being unfairly undercut by higher emitting industries elsewhere, because that's basically going to undermine our efforts to reduce emissions. So obviously, there's a number of different ways that government can introduce policies and support to help address that situation. But for us, we see a carbon border adjustment mechanism as one of those really valuable tools that governments can draw on. So the fact that the UK government has announced a UK CBAM will be introduced, and that will be applied on high intensive industrial goods such as aluminium, cement, ceramics, fertilizer, glass, we see as an important step forward to aligning sort of the government's trade policy with its net zero goals. But equally, design of that is really, really very, very crucial. And we need to make sure that particularly developing economies are not unfairly hit or stranded with sort of high carbon production, and the transition is managed as helpfully and as carefully as possible. So, which leads me to ask you a question of how policies like this are viewed in Africa.
Well, policies like these are viewed with largely a lot of skepticism on the African side, not because of disagreement around the need of highly industrialized countries to decarbonize, but more because of the potential impact based on studies, based on modeling exercises, that such carbon border adjustment mechanisms will have not just on African exports, but obviously once we touch exports, we also touch livelihoods of people. We touch jobs. So in the African context, we export not so much to the UK, but there are countries that for whom trade with the UK is quite important. It's quite minimal in the UK's import kind of portfolio, but from an African point of view, the exports to the UK for some of the countries is quite significant economically. So, if the UK introduces its carbon border adjustment mechanism without the right measures to cushion the shock on African countries, the impact will be negative. And why is that impact negative? The simple reason is that the UK, as much as the European Union, for example, are moving very fast. While in Africa, the industry is not transitioning enough, and it's not transitioning enough largely because there is very little money. And as we know, a lot of money needs to be pumped into this transition. And so the countries such as the UK, although the UK is relatively doing well in terms of its climate finance targets, but more resources need to essentially be put back. So as long as we haven't done that, and what African countries and African industries and people who depend on these industries see is a risk, but also a bit of opportunity in the sense that there's a recognition that this is the direction of travel economically for the future, and that if there are enough investments, for example, in green electricity generation, that this is in fact an opportunity for the African continent. So it's more a matter of ensuring that the tools are there to allow the transition, rather than oppose as such decarbonization measures such as the CBAM. But on that point, Sarah, you said that it would be important to look at the design. From an African point of view, from a design perspective, the argument is that it would be useful to have a temporary waiver of the CBAM applied to Africa. But I would be curious to hear, what's the thinking on your side on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think first and foremost, we say that the government needs to engage in proper dialogue with countries to identify the best way of providing support and as I said, making sure there's a good transition. So then that would potentially different things would be relevant for different countries and different sectors actually. So but based on those assessments, the UK has to be prepared to perhaps exempt countries altogether, or perhaps for a limited time frame, and at least to provide, you could have qualified exemptions, or sort of you could limit some of the coverage depending on what sectors, what was required. But at the very least, to provide financial and technical assistance to support compliance with the CBAM, and to try and help sort of align domestic frameworks so that there was a sort of a healthy carbon price in other countries. So there's lots of things it can do. We'd also think to try and make sure that it's maximally effective and to help reduce the compliance burden for countries and companies covered by the policy. We really want the UK to work very closely with the EU. I mean, the EU's going faster than the UK is, and it's designing its CBAM a little bit differently already. But the sort of having the UK CBAM as compatible with the EU CBAM, we think would be quite important to, basically reduce the burden on both of business, industry, and countries, frankly.